Decades after the first blasts of war, a group of dedicated people carried on the military's commitment to leave no one behind. I'm Amanda Dolashinsky, a reporter for Military Officer magazine, and this is The Long Road Home, a story about recovering and identifying remains of American troops killed in overseas battles. In this story, I talked to some of the experts who spend years researching and digging sites on foreign soil, all in the hope that they'll be able to bring home every troop killed in action. It's MOA members that make this storytelling possible and protect the pay and benefits for uniformed service members, retirees, veterans and their families, and survivors. You can join at MOAA.org. The Chosin Reservoir in North Korea has been the battlefield grave of Army First Lieutenant Robert Steislinger for 70 years. Each of his 11 siblings prayed for his return to the U.S., but the cruelness of time didn't allow them to live to witness it. The military's promise to never leave a fallen comrade behind had been a prolonged journey, but after nearly 7 decades, it was finally fulfilled.
I thought, it's always possible.
That's Cecilia Sheridan. She's Steislinger's niece. She's reflecting on how the family grappled with her uncle's absence and possible return over the years. From her home in Michigan, she rifled through Army documents until she found the thick spiral-bound book titled Forensic Report.
I wish I could just hand this to you and say, look it up. I'm trying among all this pile of debris that's grouped around me.
Inside, there's a photograph of a partial tibia, her last connection to her Uncle Bob, who died in November 1950 during a battle at the reservoir in the Korean War. The search continues for other families of service members missing in overseas battles. The mission to recover and identify remains of service members is led by the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. It's an office of the Defense Department. Its work has led to the repatriation of thousands of service members dating back to World War II. Their missions are supported by funding from Congress and public-private partnerships.
We have a committed organization that's been doing it for well over 3 decades. It's a noble mission. It's a sacred obligation for us.
That's Rear Admiral Darius Benaji. He's the Deputy Director of Operations for DPAA.
That we will not forget and will not leave you behind. And we'll keep searching and we'll keep looking until we find you. Simple as that. And we're committed. Everybody in our agency, all 620 some people, have that same commitment and zeal and drive to keep pushing and driving to find answers.
He stepped into his role just after the 2018 Singapore summit between North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-un and former U.S. President Donald Trump. That's where they came to an agreement to return U.S. service member remains to the United States. He was watching live video of the Honorable Carrie ceremony when 55 boxes of remains arrived in Hawaii a few months later. They became known as the K-55.
Goosebumps down my whole body watching that and realizing the gravity of that act by the North Koreans and the greater level of hope by those families, thinking that, my loved one could be an answer about my loved one now. So I was watching it, I'm thinking, and I get to be part of this. I'm like, oh my goodness, I get to come work here and do this. So that was my impression, just humbled. That's probably the best word. The best word for me is humbled by watching that live feed and understanding that.
In fiscal year 2019, the DPAA had its most successful year, recovering the remains of 217 service members from more than 35 countries. The next fiscal year, the COVID-19 pandemic halted excavations. Still, in the 5 months they were conducting operations, teams recovered 120 remains in 15 countries. There are more than 81,000 American service members still missing. More than 75% of those troops are located in the Indo-Pacific region, with at least 41,000 presumed to be deep water losses, such as plane crashes or sunken ships.
We are going to work, get up every single day, and we're going to work our hardest to find the next person and the next person and the next person and make those identifications and not stop trying until truly we found everyone that we can.
Dr. Carrie Brown is one of the agency's 30 forensic anthropologists. She manages the lab at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Her work has helped identify dozens of sailors and Marines who were aboard the USS Oklahoma when it was bombed on December 7, 1941, at Pearl Harbor. Of the 429 service members killed in the attack, just 35 had been identified in the years directly after. But through the efforts of the DoD and its scientists, 301 service members have been identified as of February 2021. It's no easy feat. Some sites are impossible to reach because of restricted access to the country or because the site is underwater. The sites that are accessible can be difficult to work on for a variety of reasons, like changing vegetation that makes them unrecognizable or steep cliffs that require helicopter transport. Once teams do reach the site, they may deal with commingling, which makes it more difficult to identify individual remains.
The example I always have of how extensive the commingling at the Oklahoma is the first casket we disinterred in 2003, which ostensibly had 5 sets of remains, 5 heads, 5 sets of postcranium, which is everything from the neck down. Once we started doing some pretty intensive DNA sampling to see what we had, we actually came up with 95 mitochondrial DNA sequences. And so because mitochondrial DNA is also not individualizing, people can share that type of DNA even if they're not related, we had a minimum number of 95 people in that first casket.
The identification process begins when remains arrive in one of the agency's labs in Nebraska, Hawaii, Washington, D.C., or Ohio. Anthropologists take photographs of each item recovered and catalog it in their database. Items are cleaned and routed to proper experts, including dental hygienists and skeletal analysts. Some of the items are sent to the Armed Forces Medical Examiner's Office at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. That's where they're compared to DNA samples submitted by family members. One of the most memorable cases Dr. Brown worked on was identifying remains of a World War I veteran. The agency doesn't typically work on World War I veterans, but they got a call in 2019 about a site in France that had neatly arranged rocks and reports involving an American. A team began excavating and found a full skeleton, which is really rare. There were buttons where his coat would have been, an infantryman badge in what would have been a chest pocket, and a first aid kit with gauze still inside. His wallet was inscribed with the initials GH and contained a newspaper article detailing the conflict apparently responsible for his death. So who is GH?
George Humphrey. He was a 29-year-old Marine.
Obviously, from a scientific standpoint, the way you found his remains was perfect. But what do you think the way you found his remains says about his buddies?
Well, oh my gosh, there's so much context within the burial as well. When we recovered him, he was buried extremely respectfully. So there was a lot of care taken. His grave was actually lined with large rocks in a pattern that you would not find in nature, right? So there's, someone had taken the time and they meticulously drew the map. And I can only imagine them trying to go back in 1921 and find it on this landscapes change so quickly, especially during war. But he was laid out. It wasn't like a typical wartime of someone, if you quick, it was a very beautifully prepared burial. And then they took the time to write down what had happened to him and then where they had buried him. And so I think it shows, that brotherhood and that amazing care that they took for a fallen comrade that we still take today.
Most missions begin years before shovels hit the dirt. Historians and analysts comb through reports, war diaries, photographs, ship logs, and memoirs. The information they gather is used to determine which sites in foreign countries teams should visit. One of the best sources to find possible recovery sites is veterans themselves. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Dan Bauman is one of DPAA's Korean War analysts. He's visited reunions of Korean War vets to gather their stories. One of the most successful recovery missions was the result of an interaction with a veteran he met at a reunion.
When we were lucky enough to talk to a guy, sergeant who fought in the Chosin Reservoir, for example, who had some handheld photography. And he took a picture of the morning's carnage after nightly attacks by the Chinese in the Chosin Reservoir. And so he took a photo of a stack of war dead that had a pretty good background behind it. And we matched that background exactly in the year 2001 on a search and recovery mission that we took there to North Korea. So he took the photo in November 1950, and we matched that photography up in 2001. And the area in which he had taken a picture of these dead, we got 12 individuals unearthed at that site. So he reduced our search parameters there of hundreds of meters down to essentially 1 meter.
The DPAA believes there are about 7,300 veteran remains from the Korean War that can be recovered. Army Captain Michael Watson said it's comforting to know people would search for him if he went missing. He's an infantry officer currently assigned as an expeditionary support team leader. He's worked on recovery sites in Vietnam and Cambodia.
We won't leave anybody when we're out fighting, and if we as service members are lost one day, we know somebody will be continuing to look for us and provide comfort for our family members in the future.
When the expeditionary support team arrives at recovery sites, team members talk to witnesses and go through historical archives to pinpoint where to start digging. Most of the time, the teams live in primitive huts with field showers and kitchens on the site for 45 to 60 days. Their best case scenario is a witness who can describe what they saw and show them exactly where to start digging. But it's more typical for the team to call an explosive ordnance device technician to walk the terrain with a metal detector, searching for any glimpse of plane fuselage or metal identification tags. Anthropologists on site decide where to start digging and set up an organized grid. The expeditionary support team works under their guidance, filling buckets with dirt to be shaken over screens in search of bone matter or other items. Captain Watson said he hasn't found bone material, but his team has celebrated the discovery of pieces of military uniforms. His team found a survival kit with a signal mirror and the sleeve of a flight suit in Vietnam, and in Cambodia, they found an identification tag. What do you remember about that ID tag? Did it look just like the ones you guys have today?
Oh yeah, it's it was a little dirty, but like you just brushed it off and it was just like it came off of your own neck almost. Quite humbling to be out there and finding something like that.
A material item isn't the same as a skeleton, but Captain Watson said he knows even the smallest item can bring comfort to a family waiting for answers.
Nothing else is found. At least they have something, but the goal is obviously to return these service members to their families here and give those family members comfort that their loved ones are back home with them.
Back in Michigan, Sheridan pores over records and maps of North Korea to learn about her uncle's service. She knows he was presented the Bronze Star for his courageous actions at the Chosin Reservoir, but it was a fellow veteran who filled in the gaps. Steislinger's artillery unit was in danger of becoming overrun by communist Chinese forces on the reservoir that day in November 1950. Steislinger and a radio operator climbed to a hill to get a better view of the battlefield so they could maneuver the platoon to safety. Their perilous task was paused when the radio operator was struck by enemy fire. Steislinger kneeled down to patch him up. Steislinger continued to finish his task, and when he reached the bottom of the hill, he told his troops he thought he'd been struck but was so cold from the icy air that no one could locate a wound. His troops laid him on a truck engine to warm up his body, but he died before they could render first aid. The men scribbled on a map to note where Steislinger was laid to rest so they could come back to retrieve him.
I actually have at least one of those maps.
Years passed, and Steislinger's oldest living descendant changed as his siblings died. 3 family members had submitted DNA to the military in hopes it could be matched against bones someday. George Steislinger was the oldest living descendant, and just before he died, he took Sheridan aside to inform her it was now her turn.
In August, I got the phone call. I picked up the phone, and they said, "This is the Department of Former Wars. It's my duty and responsibility to tell you that your Uncle Bob's remains have been returned, and you will never hear from me again. Somebody else will contact you." then it was an amazing thing with a real surge of adrenaline. And it was just like, oh, this is incredible. And then I started thinking, okay, what do I do next? You know?
I'm sorry that Uncle George wasn't able to.
Oh, I am very much too. I really was, because it was just something he was so intent on. I think part of the way I feel so serious about it is that he took it very seriously, and that his siblings all were real attached to Bob. They were really like was something very important.
His remains were in box number 23. It was a soul tibia. It was a moment of closure Sheridan wishes she could have shared with the 11 siblings who feared their brother was forgotten and abandoned.
It means gratitude, great gratitude. And for a mother of a military member, terrific gratitude. Because my son does dangerous things. You know, he's frequently been in dangerous situations. And the sense of confidence that no military member is considered insignificant is very reassuring.
The Long Road Home is a production of Military Officer Magazine and the Military Officers Association of America. Visit moa.org for more inspiring stories about service members who have pledged to never stop serving. You can also join the more than 350,000 members of MOA who advocate on behalf of veterans of all services. Just click on Join.